Hemwick, with its charnel lane, has long been viewed as a grim village dedicated to the collection and burning of corpses. But there's reason to suspect that we've fallen for many of From Software's misdirection techniques that hide the true nature of Hemwick. Some players appear to fixate on the word char in charnel, as well as the word ash from the bone marrow ash that's produced in Hemwick. Relying on these two terms, some lore enthusiasts conclude that Hemwick must be a sprawling crematorium. But as many others have pointed out on Reddit and in comments of numerous lore videos, a charnel or charnel house isn't a place where bodies are burned, it's a place where bones are stored, such as a burial vault or a small catacomb. And as I'll show today, while Hemwick might seem like a long-doomed industrial village dedicated to burning bodies, it's actually a heavily stylized depiction of the Victorian workhouse. As I've done in most episodes of this series, I want to take a moment to set the scene for this video. Hemwick has a reputation for being the least lore-intensive area of the game, and for good reason. It lacks the depth of characters, lore notes, and dialogue that give other areas a lore significance and vibrancy that we just don't experience in Hemwick. We'll see that reflected in this episode, both in terms of its short runtime and fewer major discoveries to share. But there are several interesting things to go over. With that, let's get going. To briefly refresh, I've argued that From Software used the personal story and literary works of Victorian author and poet William Ernest Henley in shaping the story, settings, and some characters of Bloodborne. If you recall from the first episode, Henley spent 2 years in the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh after undergoing an experimental surgery to save his right leg from amputation as the result of complications from tubercular arthritis. He captured his 2-year stay in a 28-poem book titled In Hospital. In the first poem, titled Interpatient, Henley described the Royal Infirmary as half workhouse and half jail. As we'll see in this episode on Hemwick and the next episode on Cathedral Ward, this description from Henley's poem appears to have shaped From Software's design choices on Hemwick's and Cathedral Ward's settings, enemies, and tiny details that we might otherwise discount as inconsequential. Let's lock ourselves into Hemwick first. A feature of urban life in 19th century England and Scotland, workhouses were state-run institutions designed to house the poor and provide a source of employment. Although poorhouses and workhouses had been in use for hundreds of years, demand exploded in the early 1800s following the Napoleonic Wars and after technological advancements in agriculture prompted mass migration of rural farm workers to the major cities of the United Kingdom. The role of the workhouse changed dramatically following the passage of the New Poor Act of 1834 that attempted to discourage able-bodied citizens from taking advantage of existing welfare programs. Although designed to ease the burden on the taxpayer while also providing much-needed relief to the poor, workhouses quickly devolved into hellish compounds where men and women, children, and the elderly were cramped into rundown facilities where they were essentially forced into servitude and slavery. As noted in the encyclopedic resource The Britannica, during the 18th century, workhouses tended to degenerate into mixed receptacles, where every type of pauper, whether needy or criminal, young or old, infirm, healthy, or insane, was dumped. These workhouses were difficult to distinguish from houses of correction. According to prevailing social conditions, their inmates might be let out to contractors or kept idle to prevent competition on the labor market. While the living conditions of workhouses could be inhumane, working conditions were even harsher. Workhouse occupants would be required to complete low-skilled but physically taxing labor in exchange for food and housing. Tasks included breaking rocks, plucking feathers, and picking oakum, essentially pulling apart braided rope with their fingers for hours on end. But one common workhouse task in particular is emphasized in Hemwick, although with a major twist. Workhouse inmates would be required to take animal bones and crush them into powder called bone meal fertilizer. This product is still in use today, but in the early 1800s, it was a process done by hand. In Bloodborne, Hemwick is best known for its bone marrow ash, a substance that improves the damage of our quicksilver bullets. We're led to believe that the women of Hemwick produced this bone marrow ash from the crushed bones of dead Yarnamites. But it's quite likely that the bone marrow ash is a direct nod to the bone meal fertilizer produced in the Victorian workhouse. I've occasionally seen and heard players describe Hemwick as a farming village, thanks to some of the weapons we see the enemies wielding, and one of the more distinctive structures we find there. But these elements actually support the workhouse concept. As we ascend higher up into Hemwick, we come across a stable. In addition to the body of a dead horse, we find hunter corpses alongside the grave women enemies hiding in the dark. Stables and barns were often used as makeshift lodgings in workhouses and poor farms. In an 1857 article in the British newspaper The Illustrated USK Observer, a journalist documented a visit by the Lord Mayor of London to the West London workhouse to view the living conditions. The Lord Mayor and his associates found that the men's casual ward consisted of a 12-stall stable, as shown here in a wood engraving, much like we observe within Hemwick. The article in the USK Observer painted a grim portrait of the inhabitants living in squalid conditions. The poor creatures, in answer to inquiries made of them, stated that upon entering the building, a small portion of bread had been given them, but that it was the custom to turn them out in the morning without anything to eat, unless they first broke a certain quantity of stones, of which there was a large heap in the yard. The Lord Mayor and his friends next entered an adjoining cattle shed where they found 2 destitute females huddled together in a rug, lying on the bare ground, almost perished with cold and without either fire or food. By the late 1800s, England's workhouses were almost entirely populated by the elderly. The artist Hubert van Herkommer captured this reality in his 1878 engraving titled A Scene at the Westminster Union, which displayed a gathering of old women in the St. James Workhouse of London. These visuals might very well have served as the design influence for the lonely old woman of central Yarnham, who we can send to Eton Chapel. We'll talk about her and the chapel in the next video. Although there are some elements of Hemwick that borrow generally from Victorian workhouses, I think there's also evidence that the grave women were inspired by the female inmates of the United Kingdom's Magdalene asylums, or Magdalene laundries as they were also known. Some players have pointed out the presence of ventilation pipes in the walls and stonework of Hemwick, which implied the existence of fires within buildings or perhaps underground. While many people believe this is smoke from underground fires, as if bodies were being burned there, I believe it's supposed to be steam, as in steam from laundering clothes. The Magdalene asylums, or Magdalene laundries, were workhouse prisons initially designed to house and reform prostitutes and women who bore children out of wedlock. The asylums emerged in the late 18th century in England, Scotland, and Ireland, before eventually popping up in the United States and Canada in the 1800s. The term asylum didn't necessarily connote mental disability or illness. The name was more a reference to the perceived moral or social unfitness of the women who were sent there. Aside from prostitutes, the asylums were occupied by women whose husbands had abandoned them, or women who struggled with excessive drinking or substance abuse. Edinburgh, which I've repeatedly suggested is the real-life parallel to Yarnham, was home to at least 4 Magdalene asylums, including the Royal Magdalene Asylum, founded in 1797. Magdalene asylums were designed with rehabilitation in mind, such that women could learn skills necessary to work as house servants or even in certain industrial settings. Learning to launder and sew clothes would provide women with skills that could translate to employment after their release. Although some of the institutions paid women a small wage for their work, manual labor was often a condition of their stay, and the asylum's provision of laundry services for outside clients generated the revenue necessary to fund the asylums. As the laundries grew in popularity, their population swelled to include young girls and women who were deemed, often without any evidence or medical examination, insane or unfit for life in society. The rehabilitation and training aspects were minimized, particularly in the asylums of Ireland, which became characterized as prisons for slave labor. An estimated 30,000 women were incarcerated in Ireland's laundries. There are a few pieces of evidence that lead me to the conclusion that the grave women are modeled off the inmates of the Magdalene asylums. As we've discussed, Magdalene laundries were initially designed to be places of incarceration for prostitutes and morally corrupt women. Within pre-Victorian and Victorian prisons, incarcerated prostitutes would be forced into manual labor, such as beating hemp with large wooden mallets. Artist William Hogarth's 1732 engraving titled A Harlot's Progress depicts prostitutes set to manual labor in Bridewell, a former palace of Henry VIII that was converted to a prison. But hemp beating also was a routine task required of workhouse inmates, as we see on this 1830s British poster showing older male inmates pounding away at hemp with large wooden mallets. I think we can say with confidence that this is why many of the Hemwick grave women we encounter are carrying this weapon. But there's more to it than that. As researcher Dr. Jo Thor noted in her 2019 study of Scotland's Magdalene asylums, occupants were trained in the typical household duties required of a servant: sewing, laundry, cleaning, cooking, and gardening. The weapons that the Hemwick grave women carry reflect these duties. Aside from the hemp-beating hammers, they carry a butcher knife, a handheld sickle, and a two-handed trowel. Each of these items would be used in either cooking or gardening. The trowel's hot iron appearance, I think, is a misdirection effect, as are the fire bombs that some grave women carry. It's an effort on From Software's part to get us to associate Hemwick with fire and thus the burning of corpses to make bone marrow ash. This in turn masks the real-life inspiration for the area. It's also worth noting that we see the garden trowel displayed prominently within Hemwick's entryway, cast in metal in a massive sculpture. Importantly, this is a sculpture of a robed woman. Because of its size and prominent placement, the sculpture is an indication to the player that this area is associated with women and the work they do, just as the Magdalene Asylum is a workhouse intended for and populated exclusively by women. Next, we can look to the naming decisions. It's worth noting that the Magdalene laundries throughout Great Britain were designed specifically for so-called fallen women. This was the exact term used in the earliest publications related to these facilities. Fallen is a term in English that can mean fallen from grace, but it can imply killed or dead. It's possible the name grave women is a twist on fallen women of the asylums. I'm not going to die on that hill, but I think it's a possibility. But where do we get the name Hemwick? I think this is actually one of the least mysterious naming decisions in the game. Wick is just an English suffix that can mean district or hamlet. The word hem, meanwhile, can refer to the folding and stitching of clothing, as in sewing, one of the primary tasks required of Magdalene Asylum inmates. I think that's where the name derives part of its meaning. But hem also means to enclose or confine, as in to hem in. As From Software loves to do, Hemwick appears to be a double entendre that means both the hamlet of close hemming and the hamlet of the confined. It captures the two overarching characteristics of the Magdalene Asylum: women's work and incarceration. In summation, the village of Hemwick is meant to reflect the grim penitentiary workhouse, a fixture of the Victorian era associated with despair and captivity. In this regard, Hemwick the workhouse is like Henley's description of the Royal Infirmary as a workhouse, a grim hospital associated with illness, despair, and captivity. One final note. We technically enter Hemwick Village once we enter the small cavern to the left of the Grand Cathedral. We emerge into a forest filled with rifle-wielding huntsmen and dogs. As we discussed in the section on Yahar'gul, body snatching in Edinburgh was a significant medical and cultural phenomenon that served as the inspiration for Yahar'gul and the School of Mensis. With that in mind, we can make sense of the role of the riflemen and dogs at the Hemwick graveyard. They're not there to keep the hunter from accessing the village of Hemwick. They're there to prevent the School of Mensis from digging up the bodies of dead Hemwick villagers in the graveyard. In the next video, we'll see how Henley's description of the Royal Infirmary as half workhouse and half jail extends to Cathedral Ward. Once you see what Cathedral Ward is truly meant to represent, you'll never see it the same way again.